Thank you very much, Tahani, for that introduction. Indeed, if it was the first plenary, that's almost 11 years ago now. Did you realize that? I didn't, I think. And also it's actually since my participation in IPBES, starting first more as a sort of outside observer of what this thing could do, to more of an active participant. I've been really preoccupied with this body, because I think it's such a interesting and also problematic, deeply frustrating, difficult part of my life. I think I've changed a lot because of my participation in IPBES, and I'm also grateful for that, but I'm also increasingly frustrated through about what I'm actually learning about biodiversity science through participating in that body. It is one thing to kind of read literature, and it's another thing to actually experience these sort of power politics that operate in science, and really sort of feel it in your belly. And I also want to write more about this particularly, but that's not the paper that I will present today. That's a harder thing for me to do, but I think it's been truly educational and also in a way transformative for me. So just to, why is that? So just to start with, and this is something I'd like to emphasize right at the start, because it really shapes a lot of my thinking at this current moment, where I've lost actually my patience with a lot of things, because the sort of incumbent polycrisis that we're actually already experiencing, and the intersections between environmental crises such as biodiversity loss and climate change, but also then accelerating inequality and injustices, really brings to the fore the need to think differently about what is needed to accomplish sustainability. And what that is, to some extent, and previous talks will have undoubtedly also raised this issue as well. Part of this has to be about the actual addressing, through knowledge, through policy, through practice, the common underlying causes of these three intersecting crises, and all the actions that we take and all the knowledge that we produce that does not address these common underlying causes is actually greenwashing, or social washing, or equity washing, or climate washing, or all of these supposed solutions are actually deepening the crisis. And I think I've become more radical in a way, although I also think that this is problematic, but this is very much in the front of my mind, thinking through these issues, and then particularly what knowledge production could mean in this context currently. So I've lost some of my patience and tolerance for what I feel also through the course of 10 years of IPBES experience of what has not been working. So I was also quite encouraged that natural scientists are also recognizing this, and this is a well-known paper in my field, and in my engagements with natural scientists, this one often comes up. And what this actually shows through the picture is that perfect implementation of our current conservation ambitions will be able to at a certain moment slow down biodiversity loss, might even halt biodiversity loss, but it will not get us back on track. It will not be able to bend the curve. So biodiversity scientists have used their modeling tools and data to show that in order to actually bend the curve, we need to address particularly land use change. And this implies that we need to start working on a just transformation towards more sustainable diets. And I think it was for me quite interesting to see how natural scientists are starting to think about transformative change in a way that doesn't include producing more protected areas, that doesn't produce better conservation, that actually looks at the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss. So I think that this is a good sign, but at the same time, we continue to have conservation. We've known about diverse problems involved with conservation, but we still have conservation. If you look at the agreements in the Montreal Agreement that was created last year, the focus is still predominantly on conservation measures. And this is in the full awareness that conservation isn't saving nature. Now, similarly, and but from another domain, we also see in science policy relations that the linear model is still firmly in place. So we still have conservation, and we still have conservation science operating in a problematic relationship with science, with policy and society. So despite the evidence that it is not working, we continue to have these maladaptive, malfunctioning ideas of what conservation science is, how it relates to policy, and what conservation is and should be doing. So due to a frustration on our part with that continuous reproduction of the status quo, despite all the evidence that it isn't working, despite all the scientific research calling for a transformation, including the transformation of science, together with a colleague of mine, we've started to ask the research question, why are we not making more progress? What is it that is actually stopping us? So the scientific community is saying all these things. They have been saying all these things for a number of years. They have also suggested alternatives, and we're not actually doing this. And a lot of my sort of thinking that is also in this talk is derived from my common conversations and the writings that came out of that with Marianne Laassen about why are we not making more progress. And it's not or at least I found it not an easy question to actually answer in a coherent way. And this talk is actually an attempt to do so. But I'm not promising coherence here. That's for you to judge. But I think that there are 4 aspects of a tentative answer to this question. And these 4 aspects are all interrelated in a way that that continues to actually confuse me. But I'll make an attempt anyway. And I should also acknowledge that this is based on work in progress derived from an inaugural lecture that I gave last October, and also work that I've started to do with Casey Lynch about particularly a concept that we're developing of science as technology of singularity. So here goes. I'll be talking a lot about IPBES, and I've been so engaged or preoccupied with this body that I tend to forget that it's quite a specific thing. And also the mode of knowledge production in a global body like IPBES is quite a specific thing. So I tend to take that for granted. So IPBES is an intergovernmental body, a UN platform. The relation to the UN is complicated, but it's established by governments who are member of IPBES. They meet in a plenary every year, where they program, but also approve so-called assessments. And these assessments are global reports that synthesize the available knowledge. And when I talk about global knowledge production, I will mostly talk about the production of these assessment reports. So IPBES, if you read the mission, is also very strongly rooted in this linear model. While it also recognizes that this linear model is not working, it's unable to actually go beyond it. And I've also stopped expecting that it might be able to. I don't think that that's in the cards, actually. So part one of the answer is framing. And this will underlie a lot of what I'll be discussing later. So I use framing in the context of science, and we also draw this from the book that we've created that is actually for teaching purposes. But I found it quite a useful opening of talks like this. So we use framing to kind of emphasize that facts cannot speak for themselves, and that they always are articulated in frames. And in these frames, facts and values inevitably entwine in ways that cannot be like separated or purified. Now, these frames are not just inevitable, they also are politically powerful because they define what the problem is. What the problem consists of. So what is nature? There's a definition power in these frames. And by defining what the thing is that we should be conserving and what conservation should also mean, they shape what is reasonable or feasible to do. And they shape what kind of knowledge we actually need in order to make those solutions practical. Now, of course, this could be all fine and well if it were not for power and power inequalities. So we have in the conservation domain deep inequities between knowledge systems. There's a dominant view of what nature is. There's a dominant view of what good scientific knowledge is. And this leads to certain frames gaining dominance over others. And how this works is, I think, important to really kind of recognize is that these dominant frames will become normalized and taken for granted. And what I aim to say with this is that they will no longer be seen as a frame. They'll be seen as truth, or they'll be seen as reality. So reality will dictate that certain problems simply exist and that certain solutions are simply inevitable, rational, feasible, and all these things. So trying to argue that there might be multiple frames and that we could look at nature in different ways is extremely difficult, because it's very easy from a dominant perspective where you believe that your perspective is actually not a perspective, it's truth, to consider you to be kind of crazy or irrational or and all these things people continue to say to me, maybe sometimes in more polite terms. But trying to kind of say that there might be multiple natures is a very difficult thing for natural scientists to accept, because it's seen as a relativist position, and they see it as such because they don't think of their knowledge as paradigm. and they think of it as truth, and they don't think of their definition of conservation and of nature as a definition. No, these are just elements of reality. So I think that many natural scientists that I engage with also in IPBES, and they're really lovely people very often, they don't understand this. They don't understand that framing is inevitable, and that framing reflects and exercises power. I think that's a huge part of why we're not seeing more change despite these repeated calls. So nature is never without framing. One of the quote here is from Timothy Luke, who wrote about eco-environmentality, saying, kind of explaining to me, and this was one of the first articles that I actually read that makes this point, is definitely not the only one, but for me this was quite an eye-opener, talking about how nature already comes to you in the shape of natural resources, but then that this kind of framing of nature is the way through which nature is then rendered intelligible, but also actionable and governable, and which then can be used to legitimize almost anything. And what Luke points to here particularly, it can be used to legitimize the continuous destruction of nature. And a well-known example of this sort of natural resourcification of nature is in the book by James Scott, Seeing Like a State, where he talks about how scientific forestry actually supported the creation of this frame of the forest as timber resource, and how actually by representing the forest in this way, they were able to optimize and make the extraction of timber as efficiently as possible. But then, of course, Scott goes on to show that actually, despite the intentions and because of this narrow framing of what it means to have an efficient and perfect functioning optimized forest, was ultimately counterproductive. So the forest, this perfect forest did not turned out to be unsustainable. So for Scott, this is a warning against, or at least, well, this is my interpretation of it and what I got out of it. It is a warning against efficiency and optimization thinking. And particularly, it is a critique of science that continues to support the creation of particular frames of nature that are focused on the optimized delivery of a singular function of the forest or of nature. And what I will then continue to show that this is very much also true for conservation. It is the same sort of mechanism at work here. So when we look at how science has framed nature, we can, for example, look at biodiversity and species as the main sort of frame of nature. So what is nature? It consists of species. And what's good nature? That's the nature that contains the highest number of species or the most rare species. Now, there's a particular scientific program behind this frame of nature as species. And these quotes kind of show this. They focus on on the enterprise of trying to describe, classify, measure all of the surviving species of this world before they go extinct. Now, what this particular framing of nature has produced is protected areas. So protected areas conveyed as sort of human-free or pristine wild nature, of course, as you have heard in previous talks, produces a number and continues to produce grave injustices for humans and for nature as well. But it's also, and this is what I wanted to emphasize here, it's also based on this optimized idea. Huh? So where protected areas should be created is very much dependent on an optimization logic. So we have science, they can calculate the relative importance of different ecosystems for global biodiversity. They have also calculations of the ones that are under highest threat. And these then become global conservation priorities where most of the funding needs to go in order to have the biggest biodiversity bang for your buck, so to say. So what this does, of course, is that in so doing, science also facilitates the destruction of everything else. So it's not just an argument for protection, it's also an argument for why the other areas are less valuable and can be safely destroyed. So this is one way in which conservation science, of course, historically has always served the interests of capitalism and the capitalist class, who is not actually dependent on these areas for their livelihoods and who can offset the damage that they produce in all the other areas in the world by funding protected areas that are considered to be the most effective and optimal places to conserve what remains of biodiversity. Now, realizing also that this is not enough, a new sort of paradigm or a new frame of nature has emerged, which I call biodiversity as ecosystem services. And here there is again a sort of a scientific program behind it where Bob Watson feels that ecosystem services could be a way to broaden support for conservation because protected areas aren't going to cut it, which is true. So this is an effort to create a better reason to protect nature. It's a better reason to create protected areas. It isn't actually changing what happens to places outside protected areas. This was the intention, but I think we are not seeing any evidence that the concept of ecosystem services or nature-based solutions for that matter is making positive changes in areas that are not protected areas. So I would say that so in that sense, it's a new argument. It's not necessarily leading to different policy outcomes, but perhaps that's too quick. So what you see here is a similar reasoning going on here from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, where they create this this interpretation of the world where ecosystem services are derived from nature. So they are in the ecosystem services are in the protected areas, but they create benefits for humans. One of these sort of logical consequences of this notion of humans derive benefits from nature is to create markets for them so that there's proper payment and compensation for this. So carbon, because of the relative strength of the climate agreement, actually, carbon has become a very prominent framing of forests, but also of other nature. I think we're increasingly seeing nature being framed as carbon. Peatlands, soils, it's everywhere. So through creating a market for the element, for the one thing that is considered most valuable about nature, you make, of course, nature's values equivalent, and you can create mechanisms through which they can be exchanged. So again, much like with protected areas where you have like species as the unit, the scientific unit that you can use to compare areas. Through ecosystem services, you can do the same. You can actually show what's the most optimal place to protect nature. So where's the highest amount of species? Where's the highest amount of carbon? Where's the highest potential of nature to serve as a climate mitigation strategy? And again, this doesn't only fit with existing interests, because it will allow capitalism to actually encroach on nature, but it also creates the argument and justification to not protect areas that are considered, in these comparisons, considered to be less valuable. So I've called this earlier in a paper measurementality. And with that concept, I try to actually, and now I would actually use framing to make the same argument, basically. But to kind of point to the sort of circularity involved here. So a concept comes up, timber, species, or ecosystem services. It's considered to be the thing that is important about nature. What then happens is that this will start to influence research programming and policy making, creating a circularity between science and policy that becomes such a powerful frame that becomes very difficult to escape. So it becomes dominant, so that we really start to understand forests as really consisting of timber. Or nature really to consisting of species, or nature really to be consisting of ecosystem services. So science has been historically, starting from colonial times, of course, been the tool for the twin processes of conservation and destruction, by supporting the setting of priorities for conservation. And of course, this means justifying the destruction of the rest, and by calculating the limits of what nature can take. So how many trees can we take out before the forest collapses? So the circularity becomes a lock-in situation, which is very difficult to escape from, because trying to escape from it means criticizing a frame that most dominant actors within that frame consider truth. And that's a very hard argument to make, of course, as Foucault also has explained quite clearly. So part two of the story, and is very much connected to this actually, is about a problematic norm within science of neutrality. And I've used this quotation here by Julia Steinberger to kind of show how the IPCC, which is a platform similar to IPBES, but then for climate change, and much more well known actually. So maybe I don't have to explain this, where she actually says, well, when the IPCC dictates that you cannot be political, it actually means that you have to accept what dominant industries want you to do. So the modeling of negative emission technologies in the IPCC scenarios is one clear example of this, where she says, well, you know, we're modeling these technologies and they don't exist. They're in the model so that a positive scenario is possible where industries can continue to emit, with the promise that has no chance of ever becoming a reality, but with the promise that they'll work on negative emission technologies and get all that excess emissions out of the air again when they're ready to do so. So she's taking issue with this idea of not being political, because she says, well, that's a different kind of politics, and it's a politics that favors the status quo. And then this was actually also for me quite an eye-opener, as I'm sure it was for her as well. But clearly, if you look at social movements, they've made this point a lot more powerfully and a lot more and a lot earlier as well. I think personally also as a scientist, I'm quite late to this game, I have to admit. But it's obvious that from a marginalized perspective, neutrality means further marginalization and actually the justification of that marginalization. So equality means a fight, means a political struggle. If you're not willing to engage in that political struggle, you're siding with the powerful. So because of this, actually, because of this politics of neutrality and the lack of recognition of framing, science has become, I think, and particularly the forms of science, again, I can be quite preoccupied with these global bodies and forget that there's other things going on as well. But global science as produced by IPCC and IPBES is actually an obstacle for transformation. And it is so by design, I would also argue. So part 3 to this is diversity and inclusion, because actually IPBES is quite, well, presents itself as a progressive body, and it does so with reason. It does so because it aims to be inclusive of different forms of knowledge and different disciplines. And it's true, it is more open to these forms of knowledge and to these forms of expertise than, for example, the IPCC is, although IPCC is also making changes, I think. But then, of course, and this is something that, again, feminists were much earlier to recognize than I have to embarrassingly admit as an environmental science. Of course, diversity and inclusion without attention to power means cooptation and means actually the reduction, the taming, the structuring, and the neutralization of diversity. And this is also what you see in IPBES and what you see very often in interdisciplinary collaboration, where, again, personal experience, where social sciences and particularly critical social sciences are in a marginalized position. You can be involved if you play their game, but there's no actual voice for what I have to say. To some extent, it was fine for me for a long time in IPBES, but I think I've lost my patience with it. So one nice example of this is the recent report that IPBES has produced. It's called the Values Assessment, where IPBES recognizes that there's diverse values of nature. That people value, know, and live with nature in different ways. And this, including this diversity, is considered important to enhance support for conservation and to enhance the legitimacy of conservation, and perhaps also to change conservation. But this is very much an argument that is more in the back. So maybe this looks nice to you. It does to me to some extent, but of course, knowing what I told on the previous slide, there's reasons to be quite suspicious of whether this appeal to diversity is also an appeal, and this is an argument I'll try to explain later, is also an argument for pluralism. So for me, the notion of pluralism, although IPBES has adopted the language of plural values, plural pathways, and plural perspectives, they don't mean pluralism, at least not in the way that I understand it. And I think that that's a real problem here. So one reason for why this diversity, although meaningful, cannot result in pluralism is because there is one method through which assessments are produced. And this follows more or less something that maybe some of you know as the dipsteer model, which is basically a big causal chain. And IPBES assessment chapters are organized along this causal chain because of the role of integrated assessment modeling, which also works according to this causal chain. And these models have a prominent place in the assessment. So if you look at the list of chapters here in the global assessment, you can see that it follows this causal reasoning. And it also allocates spots for different expertise to go in different directions. So the status and trends in nature, that's the prerogative of natural scientists. There cannot be status, you cannot calculate the status and trends for diverse concepts of nature. In chapter 2, there's only one. In chapter 4, all of a sudden, multiple futures for nature emerge. So this chapter is sort of inhabited by interdisciplinary social ecological systems scientists often. Scenarios and pathways, again, we have this modeling preoccupation where there is a recognition of pluralism, but there's not an actual ability to do this because the models cannot do it. And then, of course, the main chapter where the social scientists are is in chapter 6. So we've been fed information about how nature is doing, one nature, what is causing this state of nature, and where we need to go. And then our job is to design solutions that work for that concept of nature that has been completely dominated by natural sciences and modeling. So you can see here that although quite a few social scientists were involved in the global assessment, what they could do productively is very much constrained by the way in which the assessment works. Jasper Montana has also written about this, that there's diversity in IPBES, but then at the same time, this diversity of experts need to come together to create an effective assessment that works along the logic of how an assessment should look like and how that should work. And there's actually no space to discuss alternative methods and approaches. And to my astonishment, this is actually also true for the current assessment that I'm in, which actually, and the irony is just, dumbfounding in many ways. This is an assessment of transformative change. But the question whether we should maybe change how we do an assessment cannot be actually asked without making people angry. So that's extremely paradoxical, and is one reason why I've kind of lost my faith in this institution, although I'm still on the fence about it a little bit.
Esther, can I briefly come in? Because if we want any kind of discussion to happen, we only have about 10 minutes left.
Oh God, I'm taking too long. I was really worried I would. I'm sorry. So diversity, it's not working well. And the main thing, and this is also the thing that I haven't thought about too much, is that there is this preoccupation with the singular worlds. So this picture that I found this morning is quite indicative of this problematic. So you can see maybe in the bottom, there's this one world, but there's different values coming out of it. There's an opening up. There's broad values of nature, and there's multiple pathways, but then we have to come together to govern this singular world towards a just and sustainable future. And then all the worlds are singular again. So there can be only one world, there can only be one future, there can only be one concept of just and sustainable here. And ultimately, I think that this is where these three elements of framing, of diversity and neutrality really become very problematic here. So they're undergirded by this notion of singularity that cannot do anything else but suffocate and eat all the diversity, and that is actually part, well, actually, in my view, part of how we know, live, and enact multiple natures all the time. So ontological pluralism is, I think, the main next step to take for IPBES. So this is kind of a summary. So what do we have here? What's the problem? What is the environmental truth regime that we can recognize within IPBES? Truth regimes are totalitarian necessarily. So Latour has made some good comments about this. And I'd like to end with this. So can we actually create better knowledge that is able to really animate, not just profess diversity and pluralism, but it is actually able to animate plural natures? I've put some things here as to what that might take. But the question that I come back to all the time is, and that also is a conversation I had in the transformative change assessment with some people who also really disappointed me with their answer. But I had to think about this seriously. Can we actually expect science to do this? Because it is a question of, can the master's tools dismantle the master's house? And is it reasonable to expect it to do that? So the open question is, of course, that is what I am suggesting. Does that come down to this? And I think maybe the answer is yes, actually it is. And then what is the option? We need to burn the house down. And this is something that I keep, that is my sort of internal dialogue all the time. And I can close with that. Thank you. I'm sorry for taking too much time, Tahani. I was rambling.